Chapter 2.
This is Audible.
Dawn of Fire, Avenging Sun. Written by Guy Haley. Read by John Banks. Chapter 1. The Siege of Terra. Messinius. Khorne's legions.
I was there at the Siege of Terra,
Vitrian Messinius would say in his later years.
I was there,
he would add to himself, his words never meant for ears but his own.
I was there the day the Imperium died.
But that was yet to come.
To the walls! To the walls! The enemy is coming!
Captain Messinius, as he was then, led his space marines across the penitent square high up on the Lion's Gate.
Another attack! Repel them! Send them back to the warp!
Thousands of red-skinned monsters born of fear and sin scaled the outer ramparts, fury and murder incarnate. The mortals they faced quailed. It took the heart of a space marine to stand against them without fear, and the angels of death were in short supply.
Another attack! Move! Move! To the walls!
They came in the days after the Avenging Sun returned, emerging from nothing, 8 legions strong, bringing the bulk of their numbers to bear against the chief entrance to the Imperial Palace. A decapitation strike like no other, and it came perilously close to success. Messinius' space marines ran to the parapet edging the penitent square. On many worlds, the square would have been a plaza, fit to adorn the centre of any great city. Not on Terra. On the immensity of the Lion's Gate, it was nothing, one of hundreds of similarly huge spaces. The word gate did not suit the scale of the cityscape. The Lion's Gate's bulk marched up into the sky, step by titanic step, until it rose far higher than the mountains it had supplanted. The gate had been built by the Emperor himself, they said. Myths detailed the improbable supernatural feats required to raise it. They were lies, all of them, and belittled the true effort needed to build such an edifice. Though the Lion's Gate was made to his design and by his command, the soaring monument had been constructed by mortals, with mortal hands and mortal tools. Messinius wished that had been remembered. For men to build this was far more impressive than any godly act of creation. If men could remember that, he believed, then perhaps they would remember their own strength. The uncanny may not have built the gate, but it threatened to bring it down. Messinius looked over the rampart lip, down to the lower levels, thousands of feet below, and the spread of the anterior barbican. Upon the stepped fortifications of the Lion's Gate was armor of every color and the blood of every loyal Primarch. Dozens of regiments stood alongside them. Aircraft filled the sky. Guns boomed from every quarter. In the churning redness on the great roads, processional ways so huge they were akin to prairies cast in rockcrete, were flashes of gold where the Emperor's custodian guard battled. The might of the Imperium was gathered there, in the place where he dwelt. There were moments on that day when it might not be enough. The outer ramparts were carpeted in red bodies that writhed and heaved, obscuring the great statues adorning the defences and covering over the guns, an invasive cancer consuming reality. The enemy were legion. There were too many foes to defeat by plan and ruse. Only guns and will would see the day won, but the defenders were so pitifully few. Messinius called a wordless halt, clenched fist raised, seeking the best place to deploy his mixed company, veterans all of the Terran Crusade. Gunships and fighters sped overhead, unleashing deadly light and streams of bombs into the packed demonic masses. There were innumerable cannons crammed onto the gate, and they all fired, rippling the structure with false earthquakes. Soon the many ships and orbital defenses of Terra would add their guns, targeting the very world they were meant to guard. But the attack had come so suddenly. As yet, they had had no time to react. The noise was horrendous. Messinius's audio dampers were at maximum, and still the roar of ordnance stung his ears. Those humans that survived today would be rendered deaf. But he would have welcomed more guns, and louder still, for all the defensive fury of the assailed palace could not drown out the hideous noise of the demons. their sighing hisses 1,000,000,000 serpents strong, and chittering, screaming wails. It was not only heard, but sensed within the soul. The realms of spirit and of matter were so intertwined, Messinius's being would be forever stained by it. Tactical information scrolled down his helm plate, near environs only. He had little strategic overview of the situation. The Vox channels were choked with a hellish screaming that made communication impossible. The noosphere was disrupted by etheric backwash spilling from the immaterial rifts the demons poured through. Messinius was used to operating on his own. Small-scale surgical actions were the way of the Adeptus Astartes, but in a battle of this scale, a lack of central coordination would lead inevitably to defeat. This was not like the first siege, where his kind had fought in legions. He called up a company-wide voxcast and spoke to his warriors. They were not his chapterkin, but they would listen. The Primarch himself had commanded that they do so.
"Reinforce the mortals," he said. "Their morale is wavering. Position yourselves every 50 yards. Cover the whole of the south-facing front. Let them see you."
He directed his warriors by chopping at the air with his left hand. His right, bearing an inactive power fist, hung heavily at his side.
"Assault squad Antiochles, back 40 yards, single firing line. Prepare to engage enemy breakthroughs only on my mark. Devastators, split to demi-squads and take up high ground. Sergeant and sub-squad primes discretion as to positioning and target. Remember our objective, heavy infliction of casualties. We kill as many as we can. We retreat, then hold at the Penitent's Arch until further notice. Command squad, with me."
Command squad was too grand a title for the mismatched crew Messinius had gathered around himself. His own officers were light years away, if they still lived.
"Davescamore, Tidominus,"
he said to the 2 Aurora Marines with him.
"Take the left." "Yes, Captain,"
they voxed, and jogged away, their green armor glinting orange in the hell light of the invasion. The rest of his scratch squad was comprised of a communications specialist from the Death Spectres, an Omega Marine with a penchant for plasma weaponry, and a Raptor holding an ancient standard he'd taken from a dusty display.
"Why did you take that, Brother Krivesh?"
Messinius asked as they moved forward.
"The palace is full of such relics," said the Raptor. "It seems only right to put them to use. No one else wanted it."
Messinius stared at him.
"What? If the gate falls, we'll have more to worry about than my minor indiscretion. It'll be good for morale."
The squads were splitting to join the standard humans. Such was the noise, many of the men on the wall had not noticed their arrival, and a ripple of surprise went along the line as they appeared at their sides. Messinius was glad to see they seemed more firm when they turned their eyes back outwards.
"Anzigas," he said to the Death Spectre, "hold back. Facilitate communication within the company. Maximum signal gain. This interference will only get worse. See if you can get us patched into a wider theater command. I'll take a hard line if you can find one."
"Yes, Captain," said Anzigas. He bowed a helm that was bulbous with additional equipment. He already had the access flap of the bulky Vox unit on his arm open. He withdrew, the aerials on his power plant extending. He headed towards a systems nexus on the far wall of the plaza, where soaring buttresses pushed back against the immense weight bearing down upon them. Messinius watched him go. He knew next to nothing about Anzigas. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice was funereal. His chapter was mysterious, but the same lack of familiarity held true for many of these warriors, thrown together by miraculous events. Over their years, lost wandering in the warp, Messinius had come to see some as friends as well as comrades. Others he hardly knew, and none he knew so well as his own chapter brothers. But they would stand together. They were Space Marines. They had fought by the returned Primarch's side, and in that they shared a bond. They would not stint in their duty now. Messinius chose a spot on the wall, directing his other veterans to left and right. Krivesh he sent to the mortal officer's side. He looked down again, out past the enemy and over the outer palace. Spires stretched away in every direction. Smoke rose from all over the landscape. Some of it was new, the work of the demon horde, but terror had been burning for weeks. The Astronomicon had failed. The galaxy was split in two. Behind them, in the sky, turned the great palace gyre, its deep eye marking out the throne room of the Emperor himself.
"Sir!"
a member of the Palatine Guard shouted over the din. He pointed downwards, to the left. Messinius followed his wavering finger. 300 feet below, demons were climbing. They came upwards in a triangle tipped by a brute with a double rack of horns. It clambered, hand over hand, far faster than should be possible, flying upwards, as if it touched the side of the towering gate only as a concession to reality. A space marine with claw locks could not have climbed that fast.
"Soldiers of the Imperium, the enemy is upon us!"
He looked at the mortals. Their faces were blanched with fear. Their weapons shook. Their bravery was commendable nonetheless. Not one of them attempted to run, though a wave of terror preceded the unnatural things clambering up towards them.
"We shall not turn away from our duty, no matter how fearful the foe, or how dire our fates may be,"
he said.
"Behind us is the sanctum of the Emperor himself. As he has watched over you, now it is your turn to stand in guardianship over him."
The creatures were drawing closer. Through a sliding magnified window on his display, Messenius looked into the yellow and cunning eyes of their leader. A long tongue lolled permanently from the thing's mouth, licking at the wall, tasting the terror of the beings it protected. Bolt gun actions clicked. His men leaned over the parapet, towering over the mortals, as the Lion's Gate towered over the ultimate wall. A wealth of targeting data was exchanged, warrior to warrior, as each chose a unique mark. No bolt would be wasted in the opening fusillade. They could hear the creature's individual shrieks and growls, all wordless, but their meaning was clear. Blood, 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 and skulls. Messenius sneered at them. He ignited his power fist with a swift jerk. He always preferred the visceral thrill of manual activation. Motors came to full life. Lightning crackled around it. He aimed downwards with his bolt pistol. A reticule danced over diabolical faces, each a copy of all the others. These things were not real. They were not alive. They were projections of a false god. The librarian, Atramo, had named them maladies, a spiritual sickness wearing ersatz flesh. He reminded himself to be wary. Contempt was as thick as any armor, but these things were deadly for all their unreality. He knew. He had fought the Neverborn many times before.
"While he lives,"
Messenius shouted, boosting his voxmeter gain to maximal,
"we stand! For he of terror!"
the humans shouted, their battle cry loud enough to be heard over the booming of guns.
"For he of terror!"
said Messenius.
"Fire!"
he shouted. The Space Marines fired first. Bolt guns spoke, spitting spikes of rocket flare into the foe. Bolts slammed into demon bodies, bursting them apart. Black viscera exploded away. Black ichor showered those coming after. The demons' false souls screamed back whence they came, though their bones and offal tumbled down like those of any truly living foe. Las beams speared next, and the space between the wall top and the scaling party filled with violence. The demons were unnaturally resilient, protected from death by the energies of the warp, and though many were felled, others weathered the fire and clambered up still, unharmed and uncaring of their dead. Messenius no longer needed his helm's magnification to see into the demon champion's eyes. It stared at him, its smile a promise of death. The terror that preceded them was replaced by the urge to violence, and that gripped them all, foe and friend. The baseline humans began to lose their discipline. A man turned and shot his comrade, and was shot down in turn. Krivesh banged the foot of his borrowed banner and called them back into line. Elsewhere, his warriors sang, not their chapter war songs, but battle hymns known to all. Wavering human voices joined them. The feelings of violence abated, just enough. Then the things were over the parapet and on them. Messenius saw Tidominus carried down by a group of demons, his unit signum replaced by a mortis rune in his helm. The enemy champion was racing at him. Messenius emptied his bolt pistol into its face, blowing half of it away into a fine mist of demonic ichor. Still it leapt, hurling itself 20 feet over the parapet. Messenius fell back, keeping the creature in sight, targeting skating over his helm plate as the machine spirit tried to maintain a target lock. Threat indicators trilled, shifting up their priority spectrum. The demon held up its enormous gnarled hands. Smoke whirled in the space between, coalescing into a two-handed sword almost as tall as Messenius. By the time its hoofed feet cracked the paving slabs of the square, the creature's weapon was solid. Vapor streaming from its ruined face, it pointed the broadsword at Messenius and hissed a wordless challenge.
"Accepted,"
said Messenius, and moved in to attack. The creature was fast and punishingly strong. Messinius parried its first strike with an outward push of his palm, fingers spread. Energy crackled. The boom generated by the meeting of human technology and the sorceries of the warp was loud enough to outcompete the guns, but though the impact sent pain lancing up Messinius's arm, the demon was not staggered and pressed in a follow-up attack, swinging the massive sword around its head as if it weighed nothing. Messinius countered more aggressively this time, punching into the strike. Another thunderous detonation. Disruption field shattered matter, but the demon was not wholly real, and the effect upon it was lesser than it would be upon a natural foe. Nevertheless, this time it was thrown backwards by the blow. Smoke poured from the edge of its blade. It licked black blood from its arm and snarled. Messinius was ready when it leapt, opening his fist, ignoring the sword as it clashed against his pauldron and sheared off a peeling of ceramite. He grabbed the beast about its middle. The bloodletters of corn were rangy things, all bone and ropey muscle, no space within them for organs. The false god of war had no need for them to eat or breathe, or give the semblance of being able to do so. They were made only to kill, and to strike fear in the hearts of those they faced. Their waists were solid and slender, and easily encompassed by Messinius's power fist. It squirmed in his grip, throwing Messinius's arm about. Servo motors in his joints locked, supplementary muscle fibers strained, but the white consul stood firm.
"Tell your master he is not welcome on Terra," he said.
His words were calm, a deliberate defiance of the waves of rage pulsing off the demon. He closed his hand. The demon's midriff exploded. The top half fell down, still hissing and thrashing. Its sword clanged off the paving and broke into shards, brittle now it was separated from its wielder. They were pieces of the same thing, sword and beast. Apart, the weapon could not survive long. Messinius cast down the lower portion of the demon. There were dozens of the things atop the wall, battling with his warriors and the human soldiery. In the second he paused, he saw Dovescamore hacked down as he stood over the body of his brother, pieces of armor bouncing across the ground. He saw a group of Palatine sentinels corner a demon with their bayonets. He saw a dozen humans cut down by eldritch swords. Where the humans kept their distance, their ranged weapons took a toll upon the Neverborn. Where the demons got among them, they triumphed more often than not, even against his space marines. Support fire rained down sporadically from above, its usefulness restricted by the difficulty of picking targets from the swirling melee. At the western edge of the line, the heavy weapons were more telling, knocking demons off the wall before they crested the parapet and preventing them from circling around the back of the Imperial forces. Only his equipment allowed Messinius to see this. Without the helm feeds of his warriors and the limited access he had to the lion gates or spectoria, he would have been blind, lost in the immediate clash of arms and sprays of blood. He would have remained where he was, fighting. He would not have seen that there were more groups of demons pouring upwards. He would not have given his order, and then he would have died.
"Squad Antiocles, engage!"
he said. He smashed the charging demon into fragments, yanked another back the instant before it gutted a mortal soldier, and stamped its skull flat, while switching again to his company voxnet.
"All units, fall back to the Penitent's Arch. Take the mortals with you."
His assault squad fell from the sky on burning jets, kicking demons down and shooting them with their plasma and bolt pistols. A roar of promethium from a flamer blasted 3 bloodletters to ash.
"Fall back! Fall back!"
Messinius commanded, his words beating time with his blows.
"Assault Squad Antiocles to cover. Devastators, maintain overhead fire."
Squad Antiocles drove the enemy back. Tactical space marines were retreating from the parapet, dragging human soldiers with them. An ultramarine walked backwards past him, firing his bolter one-handed, a wounded member of the Palatine Guard draped over his right shoulder.
"Fall back! Fall back!"
Messinius roared. He grabbed a human by the arm and yanked him hard away from the monster trying to slay him, almost throwing him across the square. He pivoted and punched, slamming the man's opponent in the face with a crackling bang that catapulted its broken corpse over the wall edge.
"Fall back!"
Mortal soldiers broke and ran, while Squad Antiocles held off the foe. Telling to begin with, in moments the assault squad's momentum was broken, and again more bloodletters were leaping over the edge of the rampart. The Space Marines fired in retreat, covering each other in pairs as they crossed the square diagonally to the Penitent's Arch. The mortals were getting the idea, running between the Adeptus Astartes and mostly staying out of their fire corridor. With the fight now concentrated around Squad Antiochles, the Devastators were more effective, blasting down the demons before they could bring their weight of numbers to bear upon Antiochles. Sporadic bursts of fire from the retreating tactical marines added to the effect, and for a short period the number of demons entering the square did not increase. Messinius tarried a moment, rounding up more of the humans who were either too embattled or deaf to his orders to get out. He reached 3 still firing over the parapet's edge and pulled them away. A demon reared over the parapet, and he crushed its skull, but a second leapt up and cleaved hard into his fist, and power fled the weapon. Messinius pumped 3 bolts into its neck, decapitating it. He moved back. His power fist was ruined. The demon's cut had sliced right through the ceramite, breaking the power field generator and most of the weapon's strength-boosting apparatus, making it a dead weight. He said a quick thanks to the machine's departed spirit and smashed the top of his bolt pistol against the quick seal release, at the same time disengaging the power feeds by way of neural link. The clamps holding the power fist to his upper arm came loose, and it slid to the floor with a clang, leaving his right arm clad in his standard ceramite gauntlet. A century together. A fine weapon. He had no time to mourn it.
"Fall back!" he shouted. "Fall back to the penitent's arch!"
He slammed a fresh clip into his bolt pistol. Squad Antiochles were being pushed back. The Devastators walked their fire closer into the combat. A heavy bolter blasted half a dozen demons into stinking meat. A missile blew, lifting more into the air. Messinius fell back himself now, leaving it to the last moment before ordering the assault marines to leap from the fray. Their jets ignited, driving back the demons with washes of flame, and they lifted up over his head, leaving 4 of their brothers dead on the ground. Devastator fire hammered down from above. Anti-personnel weapons set into casemates and swivel turrets on the walls joined in, but the demons mounted higher and higher in a wave of red that flooded over the parapet.
"Run!"
He shouted at the straggling human soldiery.
"Run and survive! Your service is not yet done!"
The penitent's arch led from the square onto a wall walk that curved around to another layer of defenses. His space marines were already making a firing line across the entrance. A gate could be extended across the arch, sealing the walk from the square, but Messinius refrained from requesting it be closed, as the humans were still streaming past the Adeptus Astartes. Krivesh waved the banner, whirling it through the air to attract the terrified mortals. The space marines fired constantly into the mass of demons sprinting after them, exhausting their ammunition supplies. Shattered false bodies tumbled down, shot from the front and above, yet still they came, overtaking and dismembering the last warriors fleeing away from the parapet. Squad Antiochles roared through the arch, landing behind their brethren. Messinius passed between them. For a moment he surveyed the tide of coming fury. Endless red-skinned monsters filling the square like a lake of spilled blood, washing over a score of brightly armored space marine corpses left behind in the retreat. Several hundred humans lay alongside them. He opened a Vox channel to gate command.
"All batteries, 373 through 376, target sector 9583. Penitent Square, western edge. 5-minute bombardment." "On whose order?" "Captain Vitrian Messinius, White Consuls Chapter, 10th Company. I have the Primarch's authority."
As he dealt with gunnery control, he was also data pulsing a request for resupply and checking through layered data screeds. "Voice print and signum ident match. Transponder codes valid. We obey." The far side of the square erupted in a wall of flame. Heavy cannon shells detonated in a string along the rampart. High energy beams sliced into the square, turning stone and metal instantly to superheated gas. The approaching demons were annihilated. A few bolt rounds cracked off as the last demons nearing the Space Marine line were put down.
"Company, cease fire! Conserve ammunition!"
Nobody heard him. Nobody could. He resent the order via Vox script. The bolt guns cut out. Penitent Square was a cauldron of fire so intense he could feel the heat through his battleplate ceramite. The ground shook under his feet, and he considered the possibility that the wall would give way. The noise was so all-consuming, the idea of speech lost relevance. For 5 minutes the lion's gate tore madly at its own hide, ripping out chunks of itself in a bid to scrape free the parasites infesting its fabric. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bombardment ceased. Where the Penitent Square had been, a twisted mass of black metal and shattered stone remained. So formidable were the defences of the Lion's Gate that the structure beneath had not been penetrated, but it was like this, in small bursts of destruction, that they could lose this war. Messinius accessed the gate's noosphere. No demons had as yet rounded the projecting penitent spur to come up against their new position. When the attack came again, which it would come from the front. An ammunition train raced down the walkway from the fortress interior and came to a squealing stop 50 yards away. Medicae personnel jumped down. A Space Marine apothecary came with them. Human peons rushed about with heavy sackbags full of bolter magazines, passing them out to the transhumans. Spent magazines clattered to the floor. New ones were slammed home. Messinius contacted his squad leaders, taking a quick census of his surviving men, not trusting the digits that read, "Company casualties 23%, blinking in the upper right of his visual field. Through the smoke given off by burning metal on the far side of the ruined square, he saw movement. Auspex returns tripped his armor's machine spirit, and it blinked warnings in his helm. Threat detected.
"They're coming again," he said.
"My lord," a soft voice, one that did not belong in that moment. He ignored it.
"Engage at 50-yard range. Make every shot count."
The ammunition train was hurriedly relieved of their allotted supplies and sped off, bearing the worst wounded, to aid whichever beleaguered unit needed it next.
"Stand ready!"
"My lord," the voice became more insistent. The void ships in orbit were beginning to fire. Their targeting systems were perturbed by the boiling warp energy and the vortex in constant motion over the Imperial Palace, and many shots went wide, crashing down into the anterior barbican, a few falling as far out as Magnificent. Red monsters bounded towards them, as numerous as before, as if their efforts to thin them had been for naught.
"Fire!"
he said, coldly. "My lord, your duty rotation begins in half an hour. You told me to wake you." This time he heard. Bolters boomed. Messinius froze them with a thought, and with another, he shut down the hypnomat entirely. Vitrion Messinius awoke groggily. "My lord," his servant said, Selwyn he was called, "you are returned from your recollections?"
"I am awake, Selwyn. Yes,"
Messinius said, irritably. His mouth was dry. He wanted to be left alone. "Shall I?" Selwyn gestured to the hypnomat. Messinius nodded and rubbed his face. It felt numb. Selwyn flicked a number of toggles on the hypnomat, and it powered down, the steady glow of its innards fading to nothing and winking out, taking the immediacy of Messinius's memories with it. "The wall again?" Selwyn asked. The hypnomat's primary use was to instill knowledge without active learning on the subject's part, but it could reawaken memories to be lived again. Full immersion in the hypnomat required cooperation from Messinius's catalepsian node, and coming out of the half-sleep was never as easy as true waking. Reliving past events dulled his wits. Messinius reminded himself to be guarded. He forgot sometimes that he was not on Sabatine anymore. The local saying, "This is terror," encompassed a multitude of sins. Spying was among them.
"Yes,"
he said.
"Personal debriefing."
He shook his head and unplugged the hypnomat's input cables from the neural ports set into his arms and neck.
"Nothing new learned."
Selwyn nodded, then hesitantly said, "If I may be so bold as to ask, why do it, my lord, if you expect to learn nothing?"
"Because I can always be wrong," Messinius said.
He pointed at the hypnomat. It was a bulky machine set on a trolley, but not too big for an unaltered man to move.
"Take that away."
"Inform my armorer I will be with him in a few minutes."
Selwyn bowed. "Already done, my lord." Chapter 2. Ship of the Damned. Nephilim Anomaly. Glimpses of Beyond. Hard return. Solid object detected. Artifact logged. 30 degrees positive elevation left side. Distance 300,911 miles and closing. Data streams braided themselves into the throughput of human consciousness, bringing revelation to Magos per Scrutor Camelin Hyax 43 Tau Omicron. The Magos let his mind blend with the harmonies of data, transmitting his consciousness to a higher level of enlightenment. Solid object detected. Commencing wave powers. Identification in process. Maintain attention focus. Recommendation: do not downgrade this data flood in action hierarchy. Cogitative subroutines engaged, diverting some 3.2% machine spirit consciousness to reinforce process execution. Magos. A human voice intruded into the sacred data streams. The Magos felt a spike of unwelcome human emotion, irritation. Magos perscruta, awaken please. Holiness, we have a solid object identification resolved. Object is an Imperial ship, said Hyax. He opened his senses to the mundane world. He left behind the higher plane of the noosphere, reducing himself to a lone consciousness. The cradle room was small, being nestled deep in the workings of the purity of steel. The speaker filled what little space there was. Hyax turned his attention fully on the intruder, and the worried expression of Sub-Magos classificator Osel Den came into uncertain focus. Green lines marched across Osel Den's face as Hyax's ocular sensors recalibrated. Outlines flashed around portions of the input field, resetting contrast levels and self-seeking the best wavelengths for data collection.
"There is a ship on an approach vector," said Hyax. "I know this already."
Hyax grasped the edges of his interface cradle. Data spikes unplugged from sockets all across his body and slithered back into their housings. He balanced the weight of his torso on his hands and his numerous mechadendrites to raise himself up out of the cradle. The socket stump of his metal spine disconnected and twitched under him, arching its plugs towards Hyax's motivator carriage. "Yes, a ship, most wise one," said Osel Den. "We have no signal returns from our augurs, and all data hails to its machine spirits go unanswered. It is most odd. It will
"Cut across our course in little under 3 hours. Refrain from stating the obvious to me. It is a poor modus of informational exchange,"
Hyax said, accompanying his words with a short agony burst to Osel Den's core augments. The lesser priest let out a beep of pain.
"Recall that I am closer to the machine god's perfection than you. These tidings are known."
"My apologies, Magos. I thought you might not know. The interference generated by the Gorgon's Eye and the anomaly being strong here."
"The ship's systems are down. I intuit that it is flying blind. Its ident beacon is scrambled."
Hyax's spine connected with a solid clack. The forelegs of the motivator carriage awoke, pistons extending, lifting his machine-made pelvis up so that the final matings of socket and plug could be made. Clamps snapped shut, locking Hyax's upper and lower halves together firmly. He rose then, his components of polished plasteel, brass and adamantium gleaming in the cockpit idle lights. "You have scried the vessel," said Osel Den. He bowed and stepped back, allowing Hyax to rotate his bulky carriage. Clawed feet clanked on the deck.
"In this most sacred tabernacle, I'm at one with the purity of steel, Osel Den," said Hyax. "Of course I have scried it."
"I meant no offence. I only desired that you were properly apprised of what is occurring. We are still near to the Gorgon's Eye warp formation, and it is spreading, Your Holiness. It appears agitated. We are closing on the Nephilim anomaly, but as we grow further away from the Gorgon's Eye, it seems to be growing larger, against physical law. I am, of course, in no position to correct you, but—" Hyax cut the Sub-Magos off. He was close to interrupting his synaptic processes for a further lesson, but refrained.
"You are babbling, Osel Den," Hyax said. "I respect your attention to informational protocol. Will that be adequate to calm you? Now be silent and hand me my robe."
Osel Den fetched Hyax's robe from a peg. He kept his eyes averted, not to preserve Hyax's modesty, but in order not to betray his envy, or so Hyax assumed. Hyax pulled the robe on. Although his torso preserved the basic outline of a human body, it was entirely mechanical. The feeble biological components he was born with had been replaced. After centuries of upgrades, he was so very close to blessed purity. Osel Den did envy him. Hyax factored this into his dealings with the man. Only Hyax's brain and the much larger supplemental vat-grown organ that enhanced it were of flesh, both contained in armor-glass support tubes inside his plasteel ribcage. Even his head was pure artifice, amply furnished with superior machine sensors and a logic engine housed in the exposed adamantium skull that further enhanced his cognitive functions. He adjusted his clothes. The servo claws on his back unfolded and pushed their way out of embroidered sleeves. His mechadendrites tugged their own apertures into place, seating the mag seals around their housings. Hyax pulled his hood over his face. Multiple lensed eyes shone beneath the cowl, like a fearsome glass-eyed arachnid, but he looked more human covered, at least a little.
"I've already prepared and inloaded an intercept course to the Imperial vessel," said Hyax. "Return to the Conclave and select an optimally balanced team, which I shall lead in the investigation."
"You intend to board it?" said Oselden, his inferior organic eyes goggling wetly. "Magos, we will be entering the vessel with minimal information. The ship's course suggests it has come straight out of the Nephilim anomaly. I suggest we not approach any vessel emerging from that area before we have a deeper understanding of what we are facing there. Anything could be aboard the vessel. The great work is overrun with spirit forms anathema to good physical function. Our primary goals
"Are very closely defined, Sub-Magos. Magos Tessiricon made sure of that."
Hyax interrupted again.
"But secondary objectives are decided at my discretion. The vessel is coy in revealing its precise identity, but any fool can see it is a Chartist warp carrier of the Gulthma Ryzan template. This pattern has a minimal crew. If the material extrusions of the great warp entities are present, they will be few."
"My Lord Magos, please. I make a plea for circumspection. There are other dark fates that could have befallen the ship."
"Which we should ascertain," Hyax insisted. "Insight into the anomaly could be within our reach, but you disregard it. Understanding is the true path to comprehension, or are you too much of a coward to accept the basic tenets of our faith? What if the stories are true? This could be our proof. We will board it."
Hyax's attempt to silence Oselden failed. The lesser Magos was being particularly persistent that day. "Misdirected curiosity is a sin," muttered Oselden, downcast. "That is why Magos Tessiricon sent you here."
"So is insubordination, and that is why he sent you with me," said Hyax haughtily. "Now, assemble my team." Hyax needed no void suit to pass between the purity of steel and the captured vessel. He could have jetted across and had his feet clamped tightly to the other hull while his followers were still extending the docking umbilicus. But caution vied with his impatience. Oselden did have something of a point. There were lots of ways to die in the void. He played a mem fragment of Tessiricon's rebuke to him. The crux of it, however, was cruelly concise. "Your swashbuckling days are over, Magos Camelin Hyax 43 Tau Omicron." The old swine had said it with such a grin of satisfaction. Of all the long lecture Tessiricon had given, that statement rankled the most. Hyax had done his best to eradicate the troublesome burden of human emotion from his mind, but the hatred he felt for Tessiricon was proof of how far he had to go. Lords of Mars, how he longed to purge the last of his troublesome humanity, to be like the great Belisarius Call himself, the prime conduit of pure logic. The umbilicus concluded its unfolding with the soft knock of metal on metal, interrupting his maudlin data cascades. The semi-translucent plastec of the boarding tube walls screened out the worst of the light from the Gorgon's eye. Grav-active deckplate fans raspingly unfolded and activated, providing a floor. "The umbilicus is ready, Your Holiness," said Oselden unnecessarily. "That I can see with my own eyes, Sub-Magos." By the machine god, Hyax thought, I'm not going to let this mission break me. Oselden bobbed his head. Tessiricon had given him a ship of fools, but Hyax had to admit Oselden had chosen the investigatory team well. The exiled Myrmidon, Kul Fi, provided much-needed muscle, both in the mundane world of physical destruction and in the more rarefied realms of electronic warfare. There was a certain single-minded need for violence prevalent in Kul Fi's multiple subminds that made him irksome to be around and difficult to control, but Hyax was grateful to have his immense frame behind him. Kul Fi's body was a masterwork engine of destruction, and he too was a victim of politics. There was kinship there. Kul Fi's augmentations were so extensive he needed no void suit either. The ship's only datasmith, 89-7, the fourth and final team member, did require protection. But unlike Oselden, Hyax could forgive her sentimental attachment to flesh, for she was at least passably adept with her devices. 3 small multi-leg data hounds that coiled around and around her feet in ceaseless activity. These were the best he had. There were adepts more skilled, virtually everywhere in the Martian Empire's domains, but 89-7, Kul Fi, and even Oselden were good enough that he could feel almost proud. "Proceed," he said. 89-7 sent one of her charges racing towards the ship, where it unscrewed the airlock's exterior panel, held it aside in a clutch of metal tentacles, and plugged itself into a data port.
897 went motionless, her helm slit flickering with data transfer, taking place far from the crude realm of flesh. The doors separated, popped outwards with a brief hiss of stale air, and pushed themselves across the hull. 897's data hound whipped back its interface probe, skittered within, and set to work on the inner doors. Hayek's zoomed in on the airlock vestibule. It was lit by a dull orange emergency lumen. More of the same light shone through the single observation pane.
Emergency lumens are active, said Hayek. Data Smith, scry for active emissions from the main grid.
There is power, 897 data sent. The ship reactor is in a state of dormancy, but not extinguished. We should be able to revive it.
Then we board,
said Hayek. He took the lead, employing his omniscient axe as a walking stave. In his other humanoid hand, he carried a primed phosphor serpenter. His upper servo arms each bore eradication beamers. How fine it felt to be so heavily armed.
For the machine god, follow me.
A creeping horror set itself to work as soon as Hayek crossed the threshold. The ship was dark and emanated a cold that chilled even his metallic bones. Emotions he thought long purged resurfaced. There was a moment when he thought Osel Den might have been right and that they had no business being there. That made him snappy. Osel Den was rarely right about anything.
Report,
Hayek demanded. His voice shocked the silence of the ship. The darkness gathered between the wall buttressings seemed to thicken. 897 sent one of her hounds to suckle information from a major data junction.
I have an identity.
897's flesh voice was weak and flat, characteristics exacerbated by the voxmeter set into her void mask.
This is the Chartist vessel Evangeline, registered to Void Clan Coleopsis, operating from Bacca. Cargo manifest 39 million tons of unprocessed grains, collected at Sohelia, bound for the Talan system. They are far off course,
said Osel Den. Vox modulated, he sounded weaker than ever. Hayek despised him.
The Noctis Aeterna tossed ships halfway across the galaxy, said Hayek. It is fortunate that it emerged from the warp anywhere.
Were the crew so fortunate as the vessel? Said Osel Den. Ship log is fragmentary, but suggests unscheduled translation near or within the Nephilim anomaly.
897 pressed a button at her neck. The segments of her bronze helm folded into each other and retracted into the wide collar of her void suit. Her augmetic eyes flashed in her pale face. In the dark, her flesh looked blue and sickly.
Atmospheric circulation down. General life support down.
She pulsed detailed measurements to the others.
Air breathable. No contaminants detected. Machine systems read clean. All praise the Omnissiah.
Life signs?
Asked Hayek.
Living bioscans negative, she beeped. I have little range. Interference between Warp Rift Gorgon's Eye and the anomaly.
The hound pulled its transfer lines out of the junction. All three of them leapt into life and raced off into the ship.
I shall position hound units to facilitate deep soak readings in conjunction with the Purity of Steel's augers. Get lock readings. If anyone is alive on this vessel, we shall find them.
Hayek extruded a sampler funnel from his shoulder. It coughed as it sucked in air.
Widespread trace of airborne human genetic material, though that is to be expected.
He paused while he ran a deeper reading.
Curious. Little sign of decay.
Maybe the crew were taken, said Osel Den. Slavers? Xenos, maybe. The bringers of pain.
Drukari? Scoffed Hayek. Do you see any sign of weapons damage to this craft? For I do not. We proceed.
Hayek looked to Kulfi. Light simmered deep into the Myrmidon's metal skull. Generators engaged, charging his impressive weapons arrays. When they sang the whining songs of readiness, the party moved deeper in. The ship's design was cramped, most of its mass being taken up by enormous carrier silos. The crude part of the ship comprised two distinct segments, an enginarium far to the aft, where the reactor, warp drives, and real space engine stacks were all concentrated, and a much smaller section to the front that housed the command deck, navigator's blister, and living quarters. Being much simpler than the vast ships of war employed by the Imperium, Evangeline's crew was small. Hayek accessed the ship's primitive infosphere and ran through the crew's files. 346 Chartist voidsmen, one low-status navigator, 52 servitors, one transmechanic cast engine seer of the humblest sort, no more. It was barely enough to ensure the ship arrived at its destination intact, thought Hayeks. But the Chartists were concerned with profit above all things, and although crew stipends were ungenerous, multiplied 1,000,000 times across the vast merchant fleets, a single voidsman's wage became a considerable sum. The ship creaked and moaned, its fabric stressed by temperature differentials and failing integrity fields. Emergency lighting cast feeble pools of light. The electrophagic microbes inside the biolooms were dying off for want of energy. Hayeks pitied the vessel. He considered what to do with it. In normal times, he would order its progress arrested and send the location to the nearest Chartist representatives in return for reward. These, however, were not normal times. Most likely, Hayeks would leave it to join the flotillas of ghost ships plying the void. Given the constraints on their mission, it was not worth the expenditure of time to stop it. "I have biosign," 897 excitedly sent. She stopped dead to process the incoming data, then pulsed it out to the others. Osel Den made worried noises. Kulfi's primary armaments swiveled in their oiled sockets. "They are together," said Osel Den. "They're refectory. Why?" There was no sign of movement, no noise of life, but at least some of the crew were alive. Their faint heartbeats and body heat registered by 897's sensitive auspectoria. "Let us go and ask them," said Hayeks. As soon as the refectory slide doors yielded to Hayek's command and opened, they saw something was terribly wrong. The thick stench of human waste rolled out in a near-physical wave, so solid 897 gagged. Hayeks stood in the face of it imperiously, his superior enhancement splitting the stench and cataloguing the constituent elements. Hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, acids, bacterial effusion. "Biology," he growled, and strode within. The emergency biolooms within had mostly expired, giving only the most grudging wash of light. As elsewhere, the main lumens were out, so Hayek saw the remaining crew as heat ghosts lying about the room. Kulfi clumped up to Hayek's shoulder and ignited his search beam. Brilliant phosphor light played over slumped bodies. Only a few returned active vital signs. "What happened here?" Osel Den hung timidly back. Hayek walked further inside, Kulfi his violent shadow. The search beam shone right into living faces. Eyes stared back full into a light that should have caused immediate pain. "Intriguing," said Hayek. He holstered his pistol and lifted up the arm of one of the crew. Her uniform was filthy with urine and feces, her hair caked in drool. He let the arm drop. It flopped down nervelessly. Her chest rose and fell with steady breathing, but she showed no other signs of life. "I have no sign of higher brain activity," said 897. She had taken out a more sensitive, closer-ranged bio-auspex and was playing it over the crew. They all appeared lifeless, whether living or dead. "They breathe. Their hearts beat, but they are in a vegetative state." "Brain parasites. Mind wipe," said Osel Den nervously from the door. "There is no evidence of either," said 897. She moved around the room. Where she kicked or moved the occupants, they made no complaint, and nor did their steady breathing change. "Standard humans cannot survive longer than a few days without water, a week in optimal circumstances, 2 in certain substrains, but these people are in no way remarkable. Total baseline normal. Whatever happened to them did not happen long ago." "How close are we to the anomaly's edge?" asked Osel Den, "assuming they came from there."
2 weeks, said Hayeks, traveling at their speed of 80% lux velocity.
"The Gorgon's eye warp storm is close to our destination. If interaction between it and the Nephilim anomaly affected our auguries, then could it have affected organic systems also?"
"Possible, but not plausible," said Hayeks. "There is nothing here to enlighten us. Not all of the crew are present. We shall find the rest. 897, remain. Gather all data. Prepare the least damage of these people for transfer to the Purity of Steel for examination. The rest of us will proceed to the command deck."
The small command deck was empty of life. The oculus was a dark slit, the far left burning purple with the roil of the Gorgon's eye, but the forward view was quiet, a peaceful starscape unmarked by the warp interfaces that had ripped reality to shreds. It was a rare image of calm in a troubled galaxy, the edge of the Nephilim anomaly. The captain sat still in his worn throne, a beggar king of the voidways. He lolled in his restraints, his stubble caked in his own dribble. Hayax pushed him out of the way to get to the instruments around the throne. These were modest in number and primitive of type. A light blinked on a vox thief. Hayax replayed the final entry. The machine clicked and hissed with the noise of poor quality recording. There was no vid, audex only.
Private log. Captain Hirako. Checksum. I have no idea of the date. This is likely to be my last entry.
The man's voice was halting, dry, faint, though not from any fault of the machine. Speaking seemed a great effort to him, as if he drew on failing reserves of strength.
We have been unable to re-enter the warp. Our warp drive will not engage. The Geller field will not initiate. Engine Seer Gunfrey says all will be well, but I don't believe him. He doesn't lie well.
The man swallowed hard. Hayax distinctly heard his voice click.
The malaise has spread throughout the crew. Most of us are down with it. Nobody's died yet, praise be to He on Terra, but I fear it's only a matter of time. Where it's come from, I have no idea. I've never seen anything like it. Bioscans show nothing. There is no contamination, nothing viral, microbial, or parasitical. Nobody's ill, except everybody is.
He laughed quietly. It was the tiredest sound Hayax had ever heard.
Everything is fading out, like the colors gone from the world. I can't think. I can't sleep. Soon I'm going to be like Venfa and the others. There's a report here in the data looms if anyone ever gets to hear this. Our only hope is to get free of this dead space. See if we can re-enter the warp and make port. Any port will do. Damn the fines. I'd pay any money, all the money, if I get to live.
Although the recording had a minute left to run, a soft hiss replaced the voice for a long time.
I ask the Emperor, he said eventually, let someone find this, so I can give one last act of service that I can be proud of when I go to be by his side. Last log of Captain Hirako concludes.
There was the sound of an uncooperative finger scraping over the activation rune 3 times, and the recording cut out.
"The stories are true, then," said Urselden. "There is sickness in the anomaly. I humbly ask your forgiveness for questioning your judgment, my Lord Magos. Boarding this ship was the right course of action."
Hayax ignored him. Strip the data looms for information. Log the location of the ship. Attempt to bring the reactor back online to bring it to a stop. This vessel is important evidence. Set a beacon to proclaim our salvage rights. Prepare Astropath for Lovus to send a message back to Greya. Make sure he is ready to process a Majoris-level data load encoding Priority Ultima.
"Yes, my lord."
Urselden looked around the bridge.
"What about the crew?"
Take the captain to the others in the refectory. See if they can be revived.
"Yes, Magos."
Urselden began to bustle around the command deck, no doubt to give the impression of industry. He spun around a chair by the Vox arrays.
"My lord, there is another one here,"
said Urselden. As the sub-Magos turned from the man, he came alive. His hand shot out and gripped Urselden's wrist.
"Get off me! Get off me!"
Urselden squealed. His arm was steel, and the man's was only flesh, but there was madness in the crewman's face, and its strength was in his limbs.
I know what waits for us, the crewman raved. I have seen them, the Watchers beyond the veil.
He dragged hard on Urselden's arm, pulling him close until he was hissing in the adept's face.
It's a lie! The Emperor's light! It's not there! He's not waiting for us, only teeth and pain.
He began to weep.
I don't want to see it. I can't see it. Not anymore.
He threw Urselden back. Hayax raised his serpenter, but the man had no desire to harm them. Instead, he reached up and plunged hooked fingers into his own eye sockets, ripping the orbs free. He screamed with pain, but would not stop scrabbling, tearing at his own flesh until his front was soaked with blood and his eyeballs rested upon his cheeks. Screaming shrilly, he held up his hands.
Emperor, preserve me! I can still see it! I can still see it. I can still.
Hayek's gun gave out its metallic bark. A round smacked into the man's chest, burning with brilliant white light in the wound. Still the man did not die, but thrashed and moaned against his seat restraints until finally the bullet's fires cooked out his heart, and his struggles ceased. Osel then staggered up from the console he had been thrown against. The dead man's burning body filled the deck with thick, greasy smoke.
An act of mercy,
he said. Hayek holstered his gun.
I am not so sure.
Chapter 3. Noctis Aeterna. The Primarch sleeps. Message from Mars. 3 months had passed since the return to Terra, and finally Rabute Gilliman took rest. The night seemed to last forever when the Primarch slept. A light brought back briefly into the universe was snuffed out, and there were more than a few who worried it might never be reignited. Rabute Gilliman did not need to rest often, but when he did, a terrible silence fell at the heart of imperial government. Messenius could not help himself but check throughout the night that his gene-father still breathed. The Primarch slept in a circular chamber. Its decor was in cream and gold, but the room was not overly ostentatious. Rabute Gilliman had far more comfortable quarters he could use. After all, his palace covered an area of the Terran surface equal to a small state, and within it every conceivable form of room was found. But he had little taste for luxury, and was unmoved by the trappings of wealth. On the other hand, expectations had to be met. Gilliman had to show that he was a man of power, and to many that meant wealth. He could not alienate the powerful by a display of pious austerity. By choosing that particular room, he was showing the subtler members of the Terran hegemony that he understood what motivated others, that he respected it, but that the desire for gain was beneath him. His room was certainly far less impressive than the quarters of most ranking lords in the Adeptus Terra. Servants foisted on the Primarch by the Adeptus Administratum tried their best to make it more regal, but Gilliman's indulgence of majesty only went so far. The palace encompassed command centers, libraries, enormous gardens alive with self-contained ecosystems, pleasure domes, grand halls of ancient vintage, laboratories of obscure purpose, and new spires that crushed the past beneath thick foundations in their push to touch the hidden stars. No man could hope to visit every room in a single mortal lifetime, and besides, there were no complete plans. Doors locked for millennia might hide whole sectors left closed since the dawn of the Imperium, or open onto districts flattened to rubble by the weight of the buildings above. From the luxurious to the wretched, Gilliman's palace held it all, and it was but one such place among many hundreds embraced by the walls of the imperial palace. Gilliman could have the pick of any, for he was the son of the god emperor himself, and who would deny him? It was close to the throne room of the emperor, wellspring of human authority, yet not so close that it appeared he wished to usurp his father. Similarly, although the palace was well equipped for the making of war, including at its heart the Prefectura Astris Superba, one of the finest stratagems on the planet, it was close enough to the great buildings of state to show he was not blinded to the needs of civilian rule. Captain Messenius understood the Primarch's reasoning and was awed by it. His chapter were scions of Gilliman's line and regarded the duty of governance as equal to their life as warriors. They had presided over a small realm around Sabatine, a miniature of the Primarch's own sub-empire of Ultramar. Battle Brothers had acted as rulers of the unenhanced populace, attempting to emulate their father, and had succeeded admirably. But they had also fought. All Space Marines must. They were made for war, no matter how much the White Consuls had wished to be statesmen. That had not gone so well for them, and Sabatine had fallen. Messenius wondered what the people of Terra would make of Gilliman if they could see him at rest, for in those moments the appearances he so carefully cultivated were set aside, and uncomfortable truths emerged. Even now, after so long at his side, it was hard for Messenius to accept that the Primarch had returned from death to aid the Imperium at its greatest hour of need. To untold billions, the Primarch was a god reborn, and a god he was in many respects, but he was vulnerable. At the Primarch's order, 20 Space Marine captains of 20 different chapters stood guard around him, 10 facing outwards, 10 facing inwards, giving Messenius the feeling Gilliman could not quite trust himself, and required that the world be guarded from him as much as he from it. He occupied no bed, but stood rigidly, sleeping in armor he could not remove. An oversized frame held him upright, the sort sometimes used to assist with the arming rituals, only twice the size of a standard unit to suit a Primarch's immense stature. Mechanical claws held his ribs, waist, legs, and ankles, locking him in place, yet he gripped the handrests hard, as if the support the machine gave was insufficient, and if he let go, he would fall again into darkness. Messinius realized he was being unworthy. Guilliman had no fear. He tried his best to quell his thoughts, but the idea persisted. Guilliman was not what the outside world assumed. He was no saint. Messinius saw the fragility behind the godhead. Machines were plugged into the armor of Fate's large backpack. Though the workings of the mechanisms were mysterious, their purpose was not. They were keeping the Primarch alive. He continued to stare at the man upon whom so much rested. Messinius adored his Gene-Father for what he represented. The White Consuls were unusually scrupulous in their veneration of the Emperor, so much that some outsiders believed they worshipped him as a god. That was an error. The White Consuls were not the Black Templars, but they knew what they owed. Such sacrifices as the Emperor had made demanded more in return than any single warrior could give. Guilliman had given everything. Asleep, he looked weary. The force that filled him when he was active was a blaze sunk to embers. When awake, he appeared radiant, powerful, a being rather than a man. But now he looked lesser, his humanity burned up by the fires of his soul. Messinius had seen the same shadow of death on the faces of aged standard humans. Advanced age had always fascinated him, because he never saw it on the faces of his brothers, no matter how old they were. Ancient Space Marines became gnarled rather than withered, and if they got a little slower, they became more belligerent in compensation. Guilliman was a Primarch, as far above Space Marines as Space Marines were above the common man. He should have shown no touch of mortality, but he did. Many centuries ago, Messinius had made the pilgrimage to see the Primarch's body. He remembered so clearly the first time he had seen Guilliman in the Temple of Correction. Guilliman was enthroned within a glimmering stasis field, the Emperor's sword across his knees, and though the cut that killed him was red and savage across his neck, his expression was as commanding as that on his statues that stood in every place of worship across the Imperium. The returned Guilliman was troubled. He frowned in his sleep. The imagists and sculptors of the Imperium had preserved a good likeness of him down 10 millennia, but their efforts showed only the god, not the man. By day, he was the avenging sun. When he slept, he was a man, Messinius had come to see, with a man's imperfections and faults. A fierce desire swelled in Messinius's breast. His twin hearts thumped. He would let no one, not man nor Xenos, nor god nor demon, exploit that. Weakness humanized the Primarch. It was an essential part of what he was. The Imperium rejoiced at the Primarch's return, but they wanted a god. Messinius feared if they realized how human their newfound savior was, they would turn on him. So much of what the Primarch did was for the sake of appearances. Sometimes Guilliman contrived to appear unarmored, utilizing hidden Tri-D projectors to cloak him in the appearance of robes. The grand announcement of the Crusade, with its echoes of past martial glories, the scouring of the high table of the Senatorum, the bloody business of the Primarch's scourge, a procession down from the Eternity Gate the day he re-emerged from his consultation with his father, all playing to some extent on what people needed to see, rather than what was true. If it was subterfuge, it was necessary, and Messinius and the others went along with it willingly, but he feared the day the tricks were revealed. He wondered what the untamed beast of mankind's soul would do. He thought he knew, and he stood ready. He was the head of Guilliman's security, and intended to uphold every one of his oaths. During the Terran Crusade, Messinius had built his opinions of Guilliman as a building is made. The return to Terra was the key that opened the door. Terra was gripped by violent insurrection when they arrived. The throne world had been thrown into disorder by the breaking of the Astronomicon. The returning Primarch flew over burning towers and running battles. Whole districts of the world-smothering city were dark for want of power. Then they had passed over the walls into the Imperial Palace proper, and everything had changed. The transitways between the filthy hives were crammed with people. A sea of faces turned up towards their gunship, radiating hope. Messinius held himself to be as psychic as a bolt-around, but he could feel the adulation coming off the crowds and the bittersweet sharpness of hope. How the people had known Gilliman was coming he could not tell, but they had known. Terra's people had turned from their many woes and looked skywards as the guardians of the Emperor bore down his last loyal son from Luna. When they landed, noise louder than the greatest battle hammered at them. The Adeptus Custodes and the inner palace regiments attempted to form a parade, and no doubt the event would be recorded as one of great solemnity in the Imperium's annals, but it had been anything but calm or ordered. The crowds pressed in from all sides. Had the custodians and the Space Marines of Gilliman's Terran crusade not been there to wall him in with armor, the great returning hope of mankind would have been lost under a surging tide of bodies, all of them baying out for his blessing, weeping, crying, shouting their hosannas to the sky. Only when the Primarch's party went inside, and the minor gate Trajan Valoris had chosen boomed shut behind them, did some sense of sanity return. But they could hear the people still through yards-thick walls and feel the fevered heat of their devotion. They had expected this, of course. Next to the Emperor himself stepping down from his golden throne, the return of a Primarch was the single most miraculous event anyone on Terra could possibly imagine. What Vitri and Messinius had not expected was how Gilliman reacted to the sight of Terra. Once they passed through the planet's choking smog, they had a clear view. Gilliman stared at it impassively through the viewports, but Vitrian saw the slight knitting of brows. Whilst in the crowd, he had maintained perfect composure, but there was a look in his eyes when his gaze passed over symbols of devotion everywhere to the Emperor and his sons. Messinius did not feel emotion the same way a normal human would. He had not for a very long time, but he recalled enough to recognize Gilliman's expression as dismay. During the long years lost to the warp on the way to Terra, Messinius had seen Gilliman fight. He had seen Gilliman plan. He had watched him rule and realized the legends about him barely touched upon his ability. He had seen Gilliman rally broken men with a few chosen words. He had seen him swallow the bitter draught of pragmatism and allowed himself to be worshipped, though he never took part in the ceremonies. But Terra had done something profound to him. Maybe he had felt despair all along. Perhaps he had been hiding it since he was dragged back to life in the middle of a battle over his corpse. On Terra, he could not hide it, not completely, and Messinius had seen. The strength of Messinius's feelings troubled him. He reminded himself that he was no scholar. After some difficulty, he turned his thoughts away from the past and questions he was not equipped to answer, looking instead to his helm display and carefully running through the multiple levels of security surrounding this most important of places. Threats could come from anywhere. Many stemmed from within the Imperium itself. Simply by drawing breath again, Gilliman had made enemies. In the complex government of the Imperium, the followers of the so-called static tendency vied with those of a reformist bent. There were enough powerful people terrified by the return of a Primarch that assassination was a real risk. This in mind, Messinius ran evaluation protocols on his fellow captains for the 100th time. Nobody was above suspicion. A chime sounded in his vox bead, and the outside world intruded on his thoughts.
Yes,
said Messinius. He kept his external voxmeter offline. His helm caught his voice and kept it secret. A mortal voice answered him, thin where his was deep and strong. His heart went out to the man. They were so weak, yet they did their duty as well as they could. Humans were the real heroes of the Imperium, thought Messinius. It was easy to achieve heroic acts when one had great power, but far more impressive to do so without it.
"Forgive me, my Lord Captain of the Watch," the man said. "I have a priority message for the Primarch. Highest code clearance."
Messinius looked at Gilliman. He was so pale, so drawn.
The Primarch is studying and does not wish to be disturbed. Give me the message.
"I cannot," said the man. "It is encrypted and will not be read by our machines. It is from Mars, the Primarch's eyes only."
It could be a threat, thought Messinius. Attacks need not be with bolt and blade. A cogitatorphage introduced to the Primarch's armor systems could do as much damage as a bullet.
Show me the seal.
A blurt of data arrived noisily in his helmet. A picked illusion manifested on the helm plate, using ocular tricks to show an emblem floating some feet in front of him. Messinius pulled a face. Martian Theatre. The emblem was a modified version of the Mechanicus skull and cog.
Belisarius' call,
said Messinius.
It is his personal seal, my lord.
Anything else?
I have notification from the Adeptus Custodes of an embassy en route to the Primarch's palace now.
Where are they?
They were granted access to the lower Terran orbits by the Scalax Enclave yesterday and put down there, then travelled overland. They are currently being held at the bounds of the Eternity Loop, near the Lion's Gate. The Guardians await the Primarch's order.
Admit them, Messinius said. I act on his authority. The Lord Guilliman has been waiting for news. I shall meet with them within the hour. Prepare to hold them in the outer districts to await the Primarch's pleasure. Contain the message. I will let the Lord Commander decide what to do with it. There is no need, my son.
Guilliman's beautiful, perfect voice ended the silence of the night. He had heard the conversation. Of course he had.
Yes, my lord,
the mortal vigilator began.
A moment. The Primarch awakens.
Messinius turned to face his lord. He felt a thrill of pride every time Guilliman referred to him as my son. Thousands of years of devotion, of myth made real and worthwhile. The captains all turned to face the Primarch and got down on one knee. The claws of the arming stand hissed open and retracted. A tech priest and his servant mechanisms came forward to disconnect the tubes and gurgling vials from ports in the armor. Guilliman waited patiently until they were finished. His colour and vigour returned so quickly that Messinius could hardly believe what he had seen before, and regarded his thoughts on the Primarch's frailty suspiciously. When the last tube was unplugged, Guilliman stepped down from the frame. The massive boots of the armour of fate clicked faintly on the marble floor. Guilliman walked with the surety of a man who knows every step carries him closer to destiny's purpose.
I will meet with the Archmagos' emissaries myself, he said. I have waited weeks for this news, and will not tarry, nor wait upon convention for it. We will be leaving Terra immediately after I have met him, I predict. Prepare the Victrix Guard for the meeting. Choose 5 to come with us afterwards, and 5 of you captains. You, Messinius, and Teoshin. The rest of you may select from among yourselves. Summon my court. Notify the officers of the High 12 and tell them to send representatives if they cannot be present themselves. Contact Trajan. It is necessary that a delegation from the custodians accompany us.
Yes, my lord, said Messinius.
Where are we going? Mars. Maybe one of his ships, said Guilliman. Call is fond of dramaturgy. He will wish to reveal his works in as flamboyant a manner as he thinks I can stomach. The message and this envoy are the opening scene in his little play. There is nothing to be gained in waiting or in pretending he might do otherwise, although that is possible, because Call enjoys misdirection also. However, in this case, I doubt there will be any of that. He and I have business to conclude.
Yes, my lord, said Messinius.
Vitrian, said Guilliman, you are distracted.
He did not ask, but stated. To Messinius, it felt like Guilliman could look deep inside his soul.
It is nothing,
said Messinius. He centered himself, not wishing to display any form of weakness.
I will fulfill my orders. Then arise, my sons, said Guilliman, lifting his arms. We shall all go to see Call's envoy together.
Chapter 4. A Historian. View from the Palace. Actio Nulla. His name was Fabian Gelfrain, Septicentio level adept of the Adeptus Administratum, Priority Ultima Missives evaluation.